Oh, we've been, what a great lead in with that song. We've been talking the last couple of, this past Sunday I started this series, and it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I started this series entitled How to Save the World, and yet, thanks, Brad, and though I say tongue-in-cheek, and yet there's just this reality that we live with that says this is just going to be this way. It's just going to always be this way. Does it always have to be this way? And so I want to play around with some ideas on what we might do to actually begin this process of how to change the world. And clearly, you or I are not going to save the world, and yet there's some things we can do ourselves that may begin the process to create a sort of a rippling effect that will be that will motivate others to think about this differently. I'm just going to encourage you to think about these things with me. I'm just going to bring this up on my iPad here first. All right. So, Philip, if you'll pull up this first screen, I'll just recap last week. Some of you all weren't here. I'll recap quickly last week. Last week, we talked about how we said the step one, Carl Sagan's quote, if you're going to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to start by reinventing the universe. The idea being, of course, that anything we do is intimately, interconnectedly, interdependently a part of what has already been, what has been since the very beginning, what has been a part of creation. There's nothing we really do that we can claim, yeah, we did this independent. We did this on our own. And so the first lesson in terms of facing the world and how we might save the world from itself in the long run is this idea of we have to start from scratch. I asked you all the question last week, who loved you into being? It's a famous question that maybe you remember Fred Rogers asking when he was about to go on stage after a comedian. He was going onto a college set, and the comedian had the crowd in just a roar. They were in a frenzy of laughter. And you know Mr. Rogers, he's just like, how am I going to speak to these people? But he has to be authentic, right? I mean, that's the thing about Fred that Fred taught to all of us is this power of being authentic, of being true and to yourself and vulnerable even in that authenticity. And so after the crowd applauded the comedian as he left, Fred Rogers steps out onto the stage, and there's this awkward silence looking at, oh yeah, I know this guy. He's what the kids watch. And he looked at the crowd, and all he said was, who loved you into being? And he had hardly finished the sentence when already some of the students had tears in their eyes. When we ask that question, it brings a sort of something like stuck in our throat, this sense of maybe we're thinking someone in particular didn't love us into being. Maybe that's where we go immediately. No, that person really wasn't there for me. The reality is all of life, all of creation has conspired to get you to where you are at this moment. We are interdependently connected to everything. The ground of our being, you want to call it God, but labeling something too specifically gets us into all sorts of trouble. You want to call it the Spirit with the Native Americans, if you want to call it the source of all being, the ground of our being, as theologian Paul Tillich calls it, all of life has conspired to this point that we're a part of. The thing we get mixed up, that we forget, is we're a part of that. We have a piece of that, even as it has a piece of us. So that was step one. You have to start from scratch. Remember, you are loved into being, and to accept your acceptance. That's the first part of it. So today we're going to talk about the second part. And the second part really sort of deals with what this last song that the band did. I'm going to do another song because I like to embarrass myself, and especially after the band has performed. But this song really speaks to the same issue, step two of how to save the world. So I'm going to bring up the lyrics here. You'll recognize this song, wonderful Bruce Hornsby song. And honestly, oh yeah, thank you. Oh, there you go. Thank you. I told Brad this morning, I said, Brad, I brought my guitar, but I'm going to have to play your guitar. I played mine at the 8:30 service, and he looked at me and he said, she's a beautiful woman, isn't she? There's just something about playing Brad's guitar that it just sings for you practically. If you just go like, would you help me here? The guitar just helps you. I said that. Now watch me screw up with this thing. Standing in line, marking time, waiting for the welfare line, 'cause they can't buy a job. Well, the man in the silk suit hurries by, man in the silk suit hurries by, as he catches the poor old woman's eye. Just for fun, he says, get a job. That's just the way it is. Some things will never change. That's just the way it is. Ah, but don't you believe it? Say, hey, little boy, you can't go where the others go, 'cause you don't look like they do. Say, hey, old man, you can't stand to think that way. Did you really think about it before you made the rules? That's just the way it is. Some things will never change. That's just the way it is. Ah, but don't you believe them? Now they passed a law in '64 to give those who ain't got just a little more, but it only goes so far. And now the suits and ties, now I rewrote this. Now the suits and ties, they still roll the dice, and many still paying the price. But some would say it's just gone too far. Well, that's just the way it is. Some things will never change. That's just the way it is. Ah, but don't you believe them? Thanks, Brad. So that's the challenge I think we find. We find that's just the way it is. We're in 2020, right? So you've already read it. You've already seen it. This is the year of clear vision. This is the year when we see it right, when we get a clearer perspective on how to do it. We're going to get it right this time. Past 10 years have been buried in Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, war, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, school shootings, anti-Semitism, increasing split in our country between them and us, whoever they are, because we know that if they're not thinking like us, then they're wrong. 12 days in, and our vision's already blurred. 12 days in, and we've already experienced a church shooting. 12 days in, and in New York, there's already been an attack on a rabbi and his family. 12 days in, and we've already got possible presidential impeachments. We have a threat of a new Middle Eastern war. We have Wall Street. The words Wall Street's up, and yet at the same time, economic equality is down. So much for 2020 vision. That's just the way it is. Some things will never change. But that's not the message of the gospel, right? I mean, that's not the message of the church. And yet the strange thing is, 1,500 years into the church as it is now, or 2,000 since the time of Jesus, but basically we're the church of the 5th century. 1,500 years, and still we have these kind of repetitive problems. We have this divisiveness. We have this they versus us, or us versus them. And the thing is that we know what we need to be doing. We need to be about justice. We need to be about mercy. We need to be about compassion and humility. And then we listen to this story that Taylor read from Isaiah 400 years ago. And it sounds kind of relevant. He says to the King Isaiah, you've lived in greed. You've lived with greediness. You've lived with this power struggle. You've lived with this lack of understanding and sympathy and connection to the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And he says it's all going to get bad. It's all going to get destroyed. Things are going to go south, even your family, even your children's children. And Hezekiah says, yeah, it could get worse. That's true, but probably not in my lifetime. Maybe you've grown a little accustomed to that reality yourself. Just 3 weeks ago at Christmas time, my family got together, and I think I shared with you, or maybe I didn't. I forget where I was when I shared this with which congregation, but I shared how there were family members that didn't show up for the first time. I never thought that was possible. I always preached in here. Our table, our family was always the table. It was big. It was wide. Everybody could fit at this table. It didn't matter on which side of the political spectrum, on which side of the NRA or the animal rights. It didn't matter where you were with homosexuality or LGBTQ anxieties. I mean, everybody was at the table, and it always seemed to work. But this year, something happened, and they got into a discussion, and the discussion led into an argument, and the argument led into just a complete meltdown. And the families didn't show up. The other families did, but these were people, my nephew and my niece, and they just weren't there. And at the end of it, I walked out with my older brother, and as he was walking out with his kids, or his grandkids actually, we were walking out. Now, maybe you remember Christmas night, 73 degrees Christmas night. I don't remember, it was warm, and I was looking out there at us, and I was thinking, I kind of remember when it used to get cool on Christmas, And then I kind of smiled, and I said, but it's not like everything warms up all of a sudden, and that's a proof of the climate change thing. And then my brother, libertarian, and who sort of always argued about climate change, my brother looks at me, and he says, yeah, climate change, which is happening. And I looked at him, I thought, what? And he said, it's unpredictable. That's what the change is. You start noticing you can no longer really predict things. Things become unpredictable. They become sporadic and chaotic. And then things start to go south. And then he said, and then there'll be sort of like, the ice caps melt, and then there'll be flooding in New York and all that. He's kind of joking. He says, you'll have beachfront property. And he says, and then there'll be a meltdown, and then there'll be an ice age. And then he smiled, and he said, but I won't be here. And he got in his car with his grandkids, and he drove off. Which was a good thing, because if he hadn't, I would have grabbed him by the throat. And I would have said, tell it to them. Yeah, it won't happen in my lifetime. I'm thinking to myself, this kind of thinking happens over and over. It's just the way it is. Never seems to change. But the reality is, there's a problem here. And the challenge that I would want to ask you this morning, that I'm going to reiterate time and again, is maybe the reason why that's the way it is because right and left, wrong and right, either or, this and that, this binary way of orienting ourselves around our positions and our way in life, and even as I talk, you've already felt anxieties. Some of you are already lining up certain sort of places and positions. It's just natural. It's our biology. Even that suggests one thing. There's a different way of looking at this problem. I've said this before. I've told this story, but I think it's pertinent, and I'll share it again. You know how I traveled around the country as a musician and storyteller, and I would carry my ukulele with me and the guitars and whatever I would check on the plane. But I always had these bumper stickers on my hard shell ukulele case, and some of them were like, were my favorite music stores or my favorite radio stations, and some of them were like the Tolkien quotes, all who wander are not lost. And then I had my favorite one, which was right across the top, white with bold lettering, and it said, "Beware the dangers of stupid people in large groups." And it always got that response. It always get a chuckle. It always get a nod. And it became like a social psych experiment for me, because I would take it everywhere. And I would set it down next to different people, because I was just curious of the reaction. Surely there'd be some different reactions depending on who the different people were. And so I would carry it through the TSA security, and one of the guys would look over and go, truth, man. Then he'd look over at one of his colleagues and say, truth, right? And they go, uh-huh. And that's it, and then I'd take it to the bar. I'd take it to the restaurant, and I'd set up by the bar where the bartender was, and I'd set it up there. And he'd look over at me, and he'd say, you ain't kidding, buddy. That's the truth. And then I'd take it on some occasions to the AA lounge, to the Admiral's lounge, and I'm sitting down next to what has to be an executive of some sort. I mean, he's just dressed to the nines, and he's got his phone, and he's wheeling and dealing. And then he looks over at me as he looks at that case, and he says, oh, my God, so many stupid people. And it became this little experiment that I started to realize no matter who I showed this to, the response was always the same, regardless of it was poor, wealthy, conservative, liberal, religious, irreligious. And all of those had the same response. There was the laughter and then the saying of, ain't that the truth, in their own ways. And it left me with one inescapable conclusion, and maybe you realize this as well, we're all the stupid people. If we all see it as everybody else's problem, then we're all the stupid people. And that's a hard thing to recognize. Because I think one of the things we're missing here is that question, are we the baddies here? No. They're wrong and I'm right. I'm not the baddie here. We're all, I know we need to line up. We need this. I'm not talking about immediate crises of injustice or violence or things that you have to address quickly or I'm saying the general contextual sort of makeup of our way of relating to one another in this country is binary. It's either or. It's right and wrong. And we're all looking to find justifications. And Facebook only magnifies it. All of our social media only helps to magnify that. And the news media just loves jumping in on it on both sides. But it leaves you with one inescapable conclusion. We're all the stupid people. We're still dealing with our problems the same way we always have. And Einstein, who would say you can't solve these problems if you approach them from the same way that you've always been thinking about them, in binary sort of either-or sorts of ways, you have to see something else. The Dalai Lama said it this way when he and Desmond Tutu in that book, The Book of Joy that I've referred to in the past, he said, one of the most difficult obstacles we have to joy is our unwillingness to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves in the face of our problems. It's like the old AA adage, the old recovery AA adage. There's the hole in the road, and I keep falling in the hole, and then I even see the hole, and so I just go and I step in the hole, and then I keep trying to dodge it, but it's like I keep moving. Did y'all ever see that episode now I can't remember. No. It had, I'm just drawing a total blank, a total senior citizen moment. Okay, we'll come back to it. Whoa, because it's not in my script. Whoa, don't go off script, Tom. Stay back on script. But this idea that the obstacles we face, we sometimes just run headlong towards them. Frasier. Right? Is he not the perfect example of that? We all laughed at it, but none of us really got the point that, we're all stupid people. We do what he does. He does it boldly. We do it surreptitiously, semi-consciously, mindlessly, but we keep doing the same thing. We keep relating to one another the same way. Jesus in his text, which I think is amazing, and I really am sorry that I had to ask a youth to read this text because it says, you got to hate your mom and dad, hate your sister and your brother, and that's not what it means, of course. But it does mean it in another way, especially in the Middle East at that time, in that time period, where family, where tribe was everything. There was a code, and you lived by that, and you held to that code. And Jesus was saying, you got to give up the code. You got to let go of the tribe. That's what he was saying. If you want to follow me, it's not going to be easy because it's going to be mysterious. It's going to be confusing. It's going to be risky. It's going to be vulnerable. You got to give up the tribe. You got to give up the anchors that you hold on to. You can't belong and relate to one another if you come from a position of my own safety and security and defensiveness. Just can't do it. There was an interesting article I read about a week ago, and it was in response to the church shooting at the White Settlement Church of Christ. And it was talking about how interesting it is, almost grotesquely erroneous, because it was the fact that both sides of the gun control, gun advocacy arguments were being, that experience, that tragedy was being used to justify both sides of the argument. Which is nuts when you think about it. If that's really possible, then we're not looking at something. I'm looking at that saying, yeah, well, that just goes to show you, if that guy hadn't had access to guns, he wouldn't have been in there. And the other side's going, well, that just goes to show you, if those people hadn't had those guns in there, they wouldn't have been able to stop the shooter from killing more people. Never mind that it was a tragedy and we're glad that it was stopped. But the fact is, we're both not seeing the bigger picture. And it really didn't occur to me until about a few days later, I read an article in NPR, their online magazine. This woman, a teacher who was in Seattle, she was working with, it was a parent, I'm sorry. She was working with her teacher, her son's teacher, fifth grader. And in this fifth grade class, the teacher was doing this thing, and the parents started to notice something that the teacher had not noticed, because the teacher was doing what? Being a teacher. Which doesn't necessarily mean she was teaching. I've often told teachers and students, you need to realize, students, you're teaching your teachers how to teach. Don't let them off the hook, you know? But the teachers were being a teacher, and the parent noticed something. At the beginning of every class, at the beginning of the week, the teacher would have the fifth grade students fill out this little form and say who are they want to sit next to, so that the chaos and the sort of confusion and the anger and whatever, that the conflicts wouldn't happen. They got to choose who they would sit next to for the week. And then she would also fill in, who do you want to play with on recess? And they would fill out who are they going to play with. And then the teacher would sort of make sure that they kind of tried to mix it up a little bit. But what the parents started noticing, if you looked over a period of about a month or so, there were 2 or 3 kids that were never getting picked. It was like an X-ray looking for a tumor. And there it was, right there in 5th grade. You don't belong. You're not worthy. You don't amount to our standard. You don't match up. We don't want you. Brene Brown said that when she was talking to 5th graders once, they clarified for her what belonging means. If you want to fit in, if you want to be a part of things, that's fitting in. But if you want to belong, that means somebody wants you. And even though we know in our faith that we are wanted from the very source of our being, that's part of our practice and our faith, there's no denying we want to be wanted. We need to know that we're at a place where people want us. So the challenge is, as we look at how we face the world's crises and the world's binary orientations and the either-ors and the arguments, the challenge is for us to come into these moments and to ask ourselves honestly, even if we don't know what to ask next, but just because it's just the same as it's always been, we have to assume we're the baddies here. How are we doing this? How can we do this differently? The way that Brene Brown says, when you find yourself up against somebody on the opposite side, or you find yourself, you feel like you're hating someone, lean into it. Open your heart, let go of the tribes, and lean into it. And maybe that will start to change things.